Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Case Western Reserve University's Think Showcase. I am Provost and Executive Vice President Ben Vinson, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program. Now, this brand new virtual series provides an opportunity for the university to engage with alumni and friends around the country, to share updates about the university, and to highlight outstanding work of our accomplished faculty. Tonight's topic centers on the social and legal implications of the COVID-19 pandemic. And in that spirit, we've assembled an outstanding group to address these issues with you tonight. Now, before we hear from our experts, I wanted to share with you a couple of ways in which COVID-19 has impacted our campus and how we've been responding. Our spring semester began earlier this week on February 1st. Much later than normal. We usually begin in January. Our students, our faculty, and our staff have shown tremendous resilience, adjusting quickly to remote teaching, adjusting quickly to remote learning, and implementing health and safety measures on campus, and developing social engagement programs for our students. Now, in January, the university announced a brand new initiative, Case Western Reserve University Care, to help ensure that students living beyond our state can also access mental health care from providers familiar with the unique needs of university students. Now, this program will increase students' opportunities to quickly connect with counselors regarding specific issues, and we hope it will also provide students with additional flexibility in scheduling their sessions. Now, as with the services that our university counseling staff provides, interactions with Case Western Reserve University Care is free of charge to all of our students. CWRU Care represents a partnership between us and Timely MD, which is a telehealth provider focused solely on serving students in colleges and universities. Now, we join more than 4 dozen campuses, including Johns Hopkins University, Duke, Emory, Claremont colleges, all of these universities in this partnership. Now, it is my absolute pleasure at this point to introduce you to a champion for issues related to mental health, and that is Dean Cleve Gilmore. He is the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Dean in the Applied Social Sciences in the Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences. And he's also professor of psychology and social work at the university. A graduate of Brandeis and Johns Hopkins University, Cleve, we don't hold any of that against you. He joined the faculty of Case Western Reserve University in 1975 and became dean in 2002. Now, as dean, his visionary leadership has propelled the Mandel School into a future of excellence, innovation, and enhanced financial security. During his 20 years at the helm, let me just pause on that, 20 years at the helm, the Mandel School has opened 6 additional research and training centers. It's undergone a full building renovation. He's helped provide the school with the most technologically advanced classrooms on campus. And additionally, he's also worked to establish an online master's degree in social administration, making it the first accredited online graduate degree program at Case Western Reserve University. Now, Cleve is known for the compassion and advocacy that he displays for his students. Since taking the reins of the Mandel School, Cleve has secured 38 new endowed professorships. He's initiated the first short-term study abroad program at Case Western Reserve with enrollment that is open to all students. In addition, he's also dedicated many hours to teaching and mentoring students, resulting in his being bestowed with the John S. Dykoff Award for Excellence in Graduate Teaching. Now, in June of this year, Dean Gilmore will transition out of leading the Mandel School and will begin his retirement. On a personal note, I'm forever grateful for his leadership and for his genuinely kind nature and his compassion. He is an example, an excellent example of the leadership, fine leadership that we have at the university. Now, tonight, we are pleased to include him in the program to provide some brief remarks and to introduce our other panelists. Thank you for joining us tonight. I think Cleve is here with us, and let me turn it over to Cleve.
Thank you. Thank you, Provost Vinson. I did have a little internet connection problem at the last moment, but happy to be here. I thank you very much for the very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to work with you and also with our interim president, Scott Cowan. I welcome our alumni and friends to what I know is going to be a very stimulating hour. My role is very simple. It's to introduce the members of the distinguished panel who will be presenting this evening on social and legal implications of the COVID pandemic. Our first speaker on the panel is Dr. Sonia Minez, who is the Motto Professor of Social Work in the Mandel School and the Research Director in the Schubert Center for Childhood Studies in the College of Arts and Sciences. She will describe a just completed study of COVID-19 transmission rates and caregiver and parental well-being in Ohio child care centers. The second speaker will be Dr. Megan Holmes, who is an associate professor in the Mandel School and the founding director of the Center on Trauma and Adversity. This year, Dr. Holmes has focused on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on mental health and the ways in which individuals are coping with the stress of the pandemic. The third member of the panel is Professor Catherine Van Tassel, who is a visiting professor of law in the Law Medicine Center in the School of Law. She is the acknowledged legal expert on the Food and Drug Administration and brings a rich history as a scholar on health law in the United States. Professor Max Mellman fills out the panel. He is a distinguished university professor and the Arthur E. Petersilge Professor of Law. He also holds an appointment in the Department of Bioethics and is the director of the Law Medicine Center. He has a broad record of scholarship in areas pertinent to our discussion, such as ethics, the rights of patients, and rationing. And finally, our moderator for tonight's panel is Professor Jessica Berg. She is the co-dean of the School of Law and the Tom and Betty Lou Walker Professor of Law. She's also a professor of bioethics and public health. Her scholarship on informed consent and medical decision-making gives her an excellent background for leading our panel. So as you see, we have a very distinguished panel that's well prepared to stimulate us with their observations on social and legal implications of the COVID pandemic. So without further delay, I turn to the moderator for tonight's panel, Dean Jessica Berg.
Great, thank you, Cleve. So I would like to remind you that there is a mechanism to submit questions. You can do that during the program by emailing thinkshowcase@case.edu. We will start with some initial presentations and I will return to moderate the discussion and answer your questions. So I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Minez, who will start with her study around the transmission of COVID in childcare centers.
Thank you very much, Cleve and Jessica. I'm very happy to be here tonight to share the study that I serve as a co-investigator with Darcy Friedman as a principal investigator. The title of our study is the Ohio COVID-19 Child Care Study. And what I find very exciting about this study, being involved, is that it is truly an example of what we call a rapid response study, and is an example of how our university faculty are able to work in a very transdisciplinary way when called upon. So this is very exciting for me. This study was planned during the months of June and July. And it has representatives, as you know, myself from the Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences, the School of Medicine, which includes many of the centers there, including the Mary Ann Swetland Center for Environmental Health, Population and Health Sciences, the COVID Task Force, Clinical and Translational Science Collaborative, and the Center for AIDS Research, as well as the College of Arts and Sciences, both the Schubert Center for Child Studies and the Department of communication sciences and psychology. The study was funded by the Ohio Bureau of Workers' Compensation and supported by the Ohio Department of Jobs and Family Services. And the aim of this study was to gain a better understanding of how we might lower the spread and lessen the impact of COVID-19 among childcare staff and families who are affiliated with vital childcare programs in Ohio. The actual study took place between August 15th and November 20th. And this was a time during relatively low community spread of COVID-19. We first established 4 research questions. The first was, what are the trends in COVID-19 transmission among child care programs in Ohio? What factors drive or limit the spread of COVID-19 in child care centers? What are the perceptions of risk and safety among parents and caregivers and staff following the reopening of child care centers after COVID-19 was declared a statewide emergency? And finally, what are the levels of child and caregiver stress and coping in response to COVID-19? I'll add that my long-term study, this is very different for me. This is a short rapid response study when I have been primarily involved in longitudinal studies of high-risk mother-child dyads. But my expertise comes and my sincere interest is in the dyadic experience and how risks and stress that affect parents and caregivers are moved down through the child in their behavior and developmental outcomes. So in terms of sampling, our goal was to mirror a mix of urban, suburban, and rural settings that would be representative of Ohio. In that way, the information could be used in Ohio for Ohio families and for Ohio policymakers, but could also potentially be used across the country to inform on these questions. The data on our COVID incidents came from all 88 Ohio counties, although we sampled strategically 10 counties. We had a total of 470 participants affiliated with 48 child care centers. This included 228 child care staff, because we were interested in their experiences and needs, as well as 242 parents and caregivers. We used a variety of different types of methods, and I also think that that's a very unique and special part of this kind of study. We combined our monitoring data of the sample with statewide what's called serious incident reporting data, to look at transmission rates in childcare across both the entire state as well as our sample. We looked at these trends of transmission of COVID-19 in caregivers and children, believing that they spend a lot of time together in very close proximity. We did weekly health attestations for staff, parents and children. We did asymptomatic testing for a sampling of staff and parents. So people who didn't have any symptoms, but they were randomly sampled to have COVID tests. We also did surveys for parents and caregivers. And we did very intensive, what we call qualitative interviews for staff and caregivers, along with a focus group for caregivers. So we really were able to get at many different kinds of levels and qualities of data in this short 3-month sampling session. So I'll move on to the results and finish up quickly. I want to let you know that generally we observed quite low levels of COVID-19 among childcare workers and children attending childcare, which was not what we necessarily expected to find. Compared to the rates in Ohio, overall, the rate was very low. So 0.5% versus on average over a period of a year versus about Well, you know how it was hovering around 3 to 5% and then over 5%. And the proportions stayed low even when community spread. We saw the rates go up as community spread went up, but the proportion of childcare workers and children becoming ill remained very, very low. We found from our interview data that the essentiality of childcare was expressed on so many different levels, from parents who were both stressed at sending their children back to childcare, but also relieved because economic burdens would be lightened. And we also learned that something that's not widely known is that many of the children who didn't attend school then came to childcare where they did their online learning. And that was quite an economic and resource burden on the childcare staff. So those are things you might not know of. In terms of our recommendations, we support having reliable access for childcare workers so that if there is any spread, we can find out about it quickly. Economic support is something we're recommending, continued economic support to keep the ratio of children to childcare workers low, to keep that spread very, very low. And childcare workers need support and money for affordable personal protective equipment and for maintaining childcare worker resources, because if one worker gets sick or decides that they can't risk for their family, there was really quite the emphasis on having a lack and a shortage of childcare workers is very apparent during the pandemic. So I will leave it there and wait for further questions from the audience. And I will turn this over to Dr. Megan Holmes, my colleague at the Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences.
Thank you, Sonia. In March of 2020, everything that I knew to be changed. So our classes at the Mandel School went from teaching in the classroom to remote using Zoom. My kindergartner and fifth grade school closed down to transition to remote learning. My 2-year-old went from being in daycare to being home full-time, and my partner and I transitioned to working from home. Our family of 5 went into isolation, eliminating in-person contact with friends and family. The Center on Trauma and Adversity, which I co-direct with Dr. Jennifer King, canceled all of our in-person healing-centered training and community programming. My personal and professional life was flipped upside down. I feared that I or my loved ones would become infected with COVID. I worried about having access to supply or medical care. I felt disconnected from my friends and my family that lived across the country from me. I'm sure all of you can relate to different aspects of my story. What was happening to me, to you, and to every individual in this world is that we were all experiencing collective trauma. So collective trauma occurs when an entire society is experiencing fear of a life-threatening event that may cause them or the people they love to die. The Center on Trauma and Adversity's mission is to reduce the impact of trauma, respond to adversity, and promote healing. So despite the world being turned upside down, our center faculty jumped into action. Simultaneously in March, we launched a national longitudinal study that examined the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on mental health. And we mounted a series of virtual programming for a worldwide community that promoted social connection, stress reduction, and healing, reaching nearly 2,000 individuals within our first month. We wrote op-eds and spoke to the media to ring the alarm bells about how this pandemic was going to have long-lasting impact on mental health. You see, what we knew from the research is that traumatic events, particularly those that are reoccurring and sustained over time, create mental health problems such as post-traumatic stress, depression, and anxiety. We also knew that the #1 way to reduce those mental health symptoms is through social connection with caring and supportive individuals. The pandemic had created a perfect storm of ongoing trauma and reduced or eliminated social contact. So I'm going to share with you some of our findings from our research and then end with what the Center on Trauma and Adversity is doing to promote healing. So we now have 4 ongoing longitudinal studies with over 2,000 participants and over 4,000 data points. Data collected from April and May of 2020 revealed that 75%, 3/4 of our participants were experiencing more than one symptom of post-traumatic stress. So these are symptoms that interfere with our daily functioning, such as re-experiencing unwanted memories or having negative thoughts or moods, or having highly alerted reactions. What was staggering was that over 1/4 of our participants met the diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. So to put this in context, national estimates of PTSD are usually around 5% of the population. PTSD rates of active duty soldiers with combat exposure returning from war is normally around 8%. So in our most recent data collection in November and December of 2020, we went from 28% to 32% of our participants meeting the diagnostic criteria for PTSD. So we are currently seeing 4 times higher the rate of PTSD than soldiers with combat exposure. The picture is similar for depression and anxiety. Our most recent data collection showed that 85% of participants are experiencing anxiety symptoms and 88% are experiencing depression symptoms. When we look across different groups of people, for example, frontline medical workers, essential workers, students, teachers, parents, and we look across gender and race, these rates are holding fairly steady across groups. However, there's this added level of concern for those who have been on the front line for nearly a year now. For our medical professionals, our research paints a clear picture of extremely high levels of burnout that is linked to their levels of PTSD. So I want to pause right now and invite you to take a deep breath. This is heavy, but now I'm going to turn into talking about how we are addressing this mental health pandemic. So I mentioned earlier, the Center on Trauma and Adversity's mission is to reduce the impact of trauma, respond to adversity, and promote healing. So while we continue to do this research and examine how people are coping with the pandemic, we are also continuing to offer healing-centered training and programming, just now virtually. So our center throughout the pandemic has worked with for-profit and nonprofit organizations to reconceptualize what employee well-being actually means, to train leadership on mental health impacts of the pandemic on the workforce, and to emphasize that self-care shouldn't be the burden of the individual to do on their own time, but rather it needs to be a culture shift within the organization to create a space of community care. We also run monthly intervention groups called Healing Network Nights that focus on reducing burnout and secondary trauma among interdisciplinary helping professionals such as medical workers, teachers, mental health professionals, and lawyers. And we offer accessible resources for how to cope with the stress of the pandemic, which is all grounded in our empirical research. So I realize my time is up, and there are links posted to the website for this information and to our resources, as well as upcoming programming, including a free webinar where I'm going to be going into more detail about the collective trauma of the pandemic. So I am going to pass it over to Professor Catherine Van Tassel.
Thank you, Dr. Holmes, and hello, everybody. I'm very pleased to share with you tonight the work that my colleague at the law school, Professor Sharona Hoffman, and I have completed that analyzes how the vaccine injury compensation system that operates during public health emergencies can exacerbate health and economic disparities. We published an article summarizing this work in the New England Journal of Medicine 2 weeks ago, and a longer version will appear in a book jointly published by the Harvard and Yale Law Schools. As many of you now know, developing vaccines normally takes 10 years. However, it took only a matter of months to develop the COVID-19 vaccines. The good news is that because such a large number of people enrolled in the clinical trials of these vaccines, the majority of the side effects, with relative short onset intervals, were identified. The concern is this very short timeline provided little opportunity to identify adverse events that occur in the longer term or that are rare enough to take longer to discover. These potential adverse events are unfortunate for any vaccine recipient, but would especially burden lower income individuals. These people tend to be disproportionately of color and have limited financial resources to obtain medical care, weather any resulting job loss, and pursue compensation. Normally, vaccine compensation for recipients of most vaccines is available through the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, or commonly called the VICP. This no-fault program was created to provide an alternative legal system to ensure quick and fair compensation for vaccine injuries. In many cases, claimants who develop symptoms within a certain time do not need to prove that these injuries resulted from a vaccine, leaving only the extent of damages in question. Unfortunately, this system is unavailable to those who received the vaccine during the declared COVID-19 public health emergency. Instead, injured citizens can only bring claims under the Countermeasures Injury Compensation Program, commonly called the CICP. This program is far less generous and accessible than the VICP. It compensates only the most serious of injuries, has a higher burden of proof, has a 1-year statute of limitations from the date of vaccination, and limits damages awards. This means that individuals are far less likely to obtain compensation for their injuries from currently administered COVID-19 vaccines. So all potential recipients, but especially people in high-risk communities that tend to be made up of people of color, face a difficult dilemma: risk becoming infected or risk a vaccine injury that likely will go uncompensated. Current projections are that the U.S. will achieve sufficient herd immunity to end the emergency declaration by sometime in the late fall of 2021. This may well allow COVID-19 vaccine injury claimants who delay vaccination to file under the more generous VICP. However, for lower income and essential workers, delaying vaccination until the fall of 2021 would be especially dangerous because they're often at high risk of infection from close contact with others at work and when taking public transportation. At the same time, disadvantaged individuals who most need vaccination are also least able to weather the health and financial outcomes of a serious vaccine injury, especially if they can rely only on the stingy CICP for compensation. Only those who can afford to wait for their COVID-19 vaccinations until the emergency declaration has ended will be able to file injury claims under the VICP. This group would likely consist largely of people who can continue working remotely and socially isolating. They tend to be disproportionately better educated, higher earners, and white. This may result in significant unequal compensation for the same types of vaccine injuries between lower income essential workers who are often from communities of color and those who have the privilege of waiting. We argue in our New England Journal of Medicine article that any FDA-approved COVID-19 vaccine needs to fall under the VICP immediately, as do all future vaccines targeted at addressing infectious disease pandemics. Disadvantaged individuals who have the greatest need for vaccination, while also being vulnerable to financial ruin, must have access to a quick and fair system of injury compensation. Furthermore, penalizing early recipients of the COVID-19 vaccines undermines the important public health goal of vaccinating as many people as quickly as possible in order to achieve herd immunity. In the book, we also propose the creation of an entirely new vaccine approval process that will ensure that individuals that are represented in the population, and that the trials are conducted in a way that produces the safety and efficacy information that will help these different groups to make informed vaccination choices. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to any questions that you might have. And I now turn the floor over to Professor Max Mellman.
Thank you, Catherine. Let me begin by describing the extent of the government's power to protect the public's health. In a nutshell, that power is extremely broad. The landmark case is the 1905 U.S. Supreme Court case Jacobson versus Massachusetts. At issue in the case was a Cambridge, Massachusetts ordinance required people to be vaccinated for smallpox or face a fine, and if they didn't pay the fine, go to jail. In a 7-2 decision, the court upheld the ordinance. Quote, in every well-ordered society charged with the duty of conserving the safety of its members, said the court, the rights of the individual in respect of his liberty may at times, under the pressure of great dangers, be subjected to such restraint to be enforced by reasonable regulations as the safety of the general public may demand. Supreme Court has also upheld the requirement that children must be vaccinated against a number of diseases before they may attend public or private school, and all states have adopted those requirements. The only limit on the state's police power to protect the public health, according to the Jacobson decision, is that the government's action may not be arbitrary or oppressive. So what would that look like? Well, a requirement that people had to be vaccinated, even if they had a valid medical reason for not doing so, would arguably be arbitrary and oppressive. And this limitation arguably is the basis for the vaccine exemption for medical reasons that all states recognize. 46 states also allow religious exemptions. It's important to know that there is no constitutional requirement that the courts have cited for these exemptions, except for some decisions that say that the state can't restrict religious exemptions to persons who belong to, quote, recognized religions, because the government shouldn't be in the business of determining which religions are or are not recognized. 15 states also have exceptions from vaccination requirements for personal or philosophical beliefs. Again, no court has held that such an exemption is required under the Constitution. So the bottom line is that the government can require people to be vaccinated or face fines and jail, and they can exclude unvaccinated children from school. Well, what can the government not do? As I said earlier, the government can't impose onerous requirements on people to be vaccinated if the vaccines weren't sufficiently safe and effective. But notwithstanding some people's beliefs and contentions, the COVID vaccines being administered in this country are sufficiently safe and effective. And more importantly, this isn't a matter that people get to decide for themselves, but rather a matter to be decided by the public health authorities. By the same token, as I already said, the government can't require people to be vaccinated who have valid medical contraindications. Also, there have been cases involving the COVID pandemic in which courts, including the Supreme Court, have struck down laws that shut places of worship while allowing other establishments with similar risk profiles to stay open. So any government vaccine requirements must be scientifically justifiable and even-handedly applied. It's also probably the case that the government can't physically vaccinate people against their will. But given a sufficient medical reason, the state almost certainly could quarantine people who refuse to be vaccinated or who refuse to wear a mask. Note, though, that the quarantine would have to be humane, not, for example, how the notorious Arizona Sheriff Joe Arpaio put a TB patient who refused to wear a mask in a hospital jail cell for 9 months without allowing him to go outside, access a computer or a phone, or take a shower until the ACLU intervened. Can the government do more? Well, could it impose tax penalties or deny refusers essential government benefits? Could public places and transportation systems refuse access? Arguably they could. And the new administration already requires masks in all federal spaces and federally regulated transportation. And there's little question that the government could limit access to those who've been vaccinated in the same way. And note that many of these vaccine measures would require a way of identifying those who had been vaccinated, maybe a government-issued ID card, which raises privacy issues that need to be considered. There are other legal doctrines that might come into play. For example, a person who contracted COVID from someone who was violating public health requirements could sue that person for negligence, or perhaps even for recklessness or battery. I gave my first-year law students a similar fact pattern in their final exam last month. But as most of their answers recognize, proving but for causation that the defendant actually gave the plaintiff the disease would be a difficult challenge, not to mention trying to recover damages from someone who didn't have sufficient assets. Then there's the question of what role the private sector can have. We can talk more about this if we have time during Q&A, but it's important to note that the immunity provisions that many states have enacted shield businesses from being liable to customers and employees who get COVID, even though the Republicans finally dropped a similar federal provision in the recently passed stimulus bill. So going back to what the government can do, the question then becomes, should it? Lots of people say the government should not exercise its full public health powers. Now, I'm not talking about the people who erroneously think that what to do with their own bodies is exclusively their decision, or whose beliefs are based on nonsense they get from social media. I'm talking about pragmatists who say that vigorous exercise of the public health power will only make things worse, deterring more people from getting vaccinated. But here's the thing. The nation's deaths from COVID now exceed all US deaths in World War II. Imagine if during World War II, people insisted on acting however they wanted in regard to the war effort, refusing to obey rationing rules, refusing to adhere to wage and price controls, refusing to serve because they didn't want the government telling them what to do. Would we have tolerated that? So what's the difference? Is it that this time we weren't attacked by a foreign power? I think the analogy between COVID and a foreign attack is close enough, although it's true that it's hard to demonize a virus the way we demonized the enemy in World War II. But one thing that is different is that the country's leaders have not adequately rallied sentiment. Unlike during the war, they haven't sufficiently made fighting COVID a matter of patriotism. And that's got to change. Because there's only so much that the law can do. People have to accept that getting vaccinated is more than self-protection and protecting others. Our nation is at war, and the more people who are vaccinated, the sooner we'll win it. Thank you.
Thank you, all of you, for a really extraordinary group of research projects. And I know we could talk about all of them in great detail. We do have some questions, and I'd like to turn to those now. And I want to start back with Dr. Minnis about the research you did. As you've explained it, your research group is supporting the idea that childcare workers are prioritized in vaccine protocols, but you also found that their relative risk for contracting COVID-19 appears to be low. Could you explain that position a little bit more?
Sure. Thank you. That is true that it was a relatively low transmission, but we also, because we did in-depth interviews with families and caregivers, there were circumstances that created and were adhered to related to that low transmission rate. And we're not sure if they can and will be sustained. And those were additional funds so that the ratio of child to care worker was lower, really intensive adherence, both from the families. That idea that Max just mentioned about the sentiment was really there. They trusted the child care workers, they were entrusted their children to them. And we heard back from child care workers that they really did everything they could to keep their exposure outside the child care very low. So we don't know that they wouldn't have been more at risk if they hadn't been subsidized for some of these things and were able to maintain them. But as time goes on, that could wane. And child care workers spend a tremendous amount of time with children, very close contact, and they could be vectors if they're not vaccinated and adhering to all of the rules related to lowering transmission.
Thank you. Before I let you go, I have a question actually that came up that really I'd like each of you to say something briefly about, which asks this more general question about equitable distribution of vaccines and whether you have any thoughts about how or the many ways in which we might define equitable.
I do have a quick comment about that. Child care workers in Ohio were not included with educators as being high priority. And we see that as really somewhat of a problem because of the close proximity and that many child care workers are very vulnerable. They don't make a high earning, they cannot work from their homes, they have to be present, and also make up that there's a number of minority status among childcare workers. So we think there's some real inequity going on there.
Dr. Holmes, I wonder if you could also comment on that question about how we think about equitable.
Yeah, and I'll comment on it from the stance of how we're looking at it in terms of mental health. And so one of our local studies that we launched was looking at the health disparities among Black and brown skinned individuals. And the reason we did this is because we saw in the news that they were getting infected at higher rates and dying at higher rates than white individuals. And so we are right now looking at whether that also translates to mental health disparities, and planning on programming that will help address any inequities that may come up, particularly around mental health for our local community.
Professor Van Tassel, could you comment also on this question of equitable?
Sure. I have been hearing an awful lot of stories about vaccine tourism, and it is unfortunate. What we're seeing is that individuals are traveling far distances to go to other states to get vaccines and jump the line. And even within communities, what we've had is, for example, in New York City, very targeted distribution centers to focus on groups who had adverse impacts of COVID-19. And what we saw was individuals from one community, white individuals who were traveling to the other communities where there was a disparate impact among individuals of color, and once again getting vaccinated there. So I think one of the things that everyone should be aware of is that if we are going to distribute these equitably, that there needs to be some mechanisms in place to check people's residences, maybe driver's license, et cetera, so that when we're doing targeted distribution to deal with inequities, that those systems can actually work.
Great. And Professor Mehlman, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, I would say that the primary principle for equitable distribution is medical need, but that leaves the question of, should it be given, should the priority be to those who are likely to get the sickest if they aren't vaccinated, or those who are most likely to be restored to a reasonable quality of life if they do get vaccinated? And interestingly, we're largely pursuing the first principle, but it's the second principle that is the guiding principle behind triage, both in medicine and in the military. And you might know that we used to allocate scarce ICU beds to people based on who was the sickest. And then eventually we changed that to who was likely to recover, most likely to recover if they got intensive care. And the mortality rate in the ICU dropped from 80% to 20%. So we're thinking about which medical principle ought to govern.
Thank you. I have a question here. I want to circle back to Dr. Holmes and thinking a little bit more about the ways in which our mechanisms of coping might have changed or addressing stress right now have changed.
That's a really good question. So our initial concern was that individuals are not going to be connecting with others at the same rate that they would have before because of the mandatory stay-at-home orders, the physical distancing, and whatnot. So what we saw in the data is twofold. One, individuals are using adaptive, so good ways to cope. So taking walks, connecting with friends via, virtual ways like we're doing right now, and trying to do new skills or reconnecting with old skills like knitting or sewing or baking or whatnot. We also saw maladaptive, so individuals who were drinking more than they had been before, using substances to relax their bodies, what we have on our website, which there is a link to it, are the key ways that we recommend to cope with stress, which are to take care of your body. So that means eat, sleep, exercise, rest, take a break from the news. It is overwhelming to see not only the information about the pandemic, but other areas that are stress inducing. Connect with others as much as you can while being safe. So if you're outside physically distant, but you're still able to see each other or connect through digital ways, do activities you enjoy. And finally, if you're experiencing any of those mental health symptoms that I mentioned before, seek mental health support for it. Right now, there are so many people that are struggling. And so I do encourage that aspect.
Thank you. I think those are extremely helpful suggestions. Professor Van Tassel, could you tell us a little bit more about the point you made that the disparities in the vaccine injury compensation can also result in greater vaccine hesitancy among low-income or minority populations?
Oh, thank you for that question. Jessica, it's a matter of trust. We know from a whole series of polls that many are currently vaccine hesitant because they have a mistrust in government. And in the unlikely event that there are a small number of people who suffer from injuries that weren't detected during the clinical trial process, like what happened during the National Swine Flu Immunization Program, and these people don't get compensated for their injuries, this could have a serious negative impact on public trust of vaccine programs moving forward, particularly as it's likely that these stories will be picked up by social media. And what we do now could cast a long shadow for decades into the future. Experts are predicting now that it's likely in a short order, the world will face a series of future global pandemics, and many have long worried about bioterrorism attacks. Establishing the correct incentives and relief mechanisms for people who receive vaccinations now is therefore of critical importance.
Great, thank you. Professor Mehlman, you mentioned you might be able to get back to this idea of limits on the private sector, like employers and businesses. And one of our questions really focused on that, asking, do you think you could make people show vaccine certificates before flying or getting on buses, going into a particular business or taking advantage of some kind of a resource?
Well, the new administration has already imposed a mask requirement for public transportation. I don't see any difference from a legal point of view between a mask requirement and a vaccine requirement. I mean, yes, vaccination is more intrusive and so on, but I think the public health law and the principles are the same. And I think employers could, businesses can certainly refuse access to people who are not vaccinated. The question, I guess, is how do you prove it? Do you show a card? Can you counterfeit the card? Does everybody get a microchip? Do we do what, God forbid, Linus Pauling, the Nobel chemist, who won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, wanted to do to African Americans during the in the late '60s, actually, that if one person was a sickle cell carrier, they would get an S tattooed on their forehead. So they wouldn't mate with another S forehead tattooed person. I don't think we want to put V's on our forehead, but we need a good, reliable, and way of knowing who is vaccinated and who isn't, and at the same time that we protect people's dignity.
Great, thank you. This next question is really for probably more Dr. Minnies and Dr. Holmes. It's a question about whether our local community feels comfortable participating in clinical trials. And you can take this both for the clinical trials or just the research trials that you may have engaged in, but it may also refer to whether you think the community feels comfortable participating in research trials related to the vaccines, which obviously were a precursor to some of this rollout. Dr. Minnies, why don't you go first?
Sure. Thanks for that question. It's a tough one, and people are collecting data on that right now. It's very varied perceptions of safety depending on many different kinds of things, the type of education you've had, race and culture. Dr. Holmes and I both are participating on a Case Western Reserve University committee to think through what would be meaningful communications to people who are on the fence or who have decided that they weren't. So this is a very topical question. I don't know that there's a answer. There are some articles coming out about that now that have to do with how important it is to see models. And I want to emphasize both that are of similar race, but also professions, because people are not equally, as you would think, thinking or feeling that this is saved. So I don't, Megan, do you, or Dr. Holmes, do you have anything else to add?
I would just echo that, there's a lot of different points of education that can happen around what the vaccine is, what the clinical trials are about, and really trying to correct any misinformation about it is what we're doing with that committee, and looking at, what our local community around the university knows or thinks about getting vaccinated, and how we can play a role in supporting them in getting vaccinated.
I wonder if you could help us in thinking a little bit about workers' compensation. I know this takes you a little off base where you were, and could you comment at all about whether or not getting COVID in the workplace would lead to a workers' compensation claim? Professor Mehlman, can you comment on that at all, or is that an area you would be comfortable with?
Yeah, it's not really an area that I've researched, but as I said in my presentation, there laws have been passed that shield businesses from liability to their employees, and I would assume that, and what I don't know the extent to which that shield extends to any form of compensation or just to civil suits.
Okay, I understand Professor Van Tassel is back, and so if you can bring her into our panel, great. If you can answer that question, that would be great for us.
Jessica, I'm so sorry, but I didn't hear your question because I was booted off.
So the question is, can you help us in thinking about contracting COVID in a workplace and whether or not this would be a workers' compensation claim? We may have lost you again on that. We'll move on from that at the moment and see if we can cycle back to it if it becomes an issue. So, we've asked about a variety of different issues here. I'm wondering, one of the things that came up in the questions is about, the racial justice issues that really pervade this pandemic. The impact of the pandemic, the access to treatments, the access now to vaccines. Are any of you thinking in long-term ways about how we can start to address this? So in some ways, the inequities predated the pandemic, absolutely, but the pandemic spotlighted how devastating they could be on various communities. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about, maybe we'll start with Professor Mehlman. Legally, do you think there are things that we can or should be doing in this area? And then I'll ask others of you to weigh in some of your other areas.
Well, I think we have more than ample legal precedent for, sanctioning discriminatory public health, the use of public health powers in a discriminatory fashion. What really bothers me is that and it's been mentioned before, is the reluctance to be vaccinated that stems from distrust of the public health system, and the discrimination that we're seeing in access to vaccination and other, preventive measures, just reinforces that and reifies it, and that's just completely unacceptable.
Dr. Holmes or Dr. Minnies, do you have something you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I can add that From a social work perspective, we need to continue to fight this social injustice of racism and oppression. And it's both on the personal level and how we talk to individuals, how we communicate with others, but it is also on a systemic level. And so we know that the systems have been set up to be oppressive towards individuals with Black and brown skin. And so when we're thinking about community access to resources, we need to look at the systems that were set up in terms of transportation, in terms of technology. Do they actually have access to know where vaccines are being distributed? We need to look at, their access to healthcare within those communities. So this is both individual as well as systemic that we need to be fighting.
I completely agree with Dr. Holmes about really having to look at the systemic process. And in that vein, I'd like to point out that in general, mental health care just itself has not been necessarily equitably supported. And then among families and children with Black and brown skin, mental health behavioral issues, developmental issues are often attributed to, they're not treated in the same respectful way and attributed to perhaps character as opposed to getting. And I think for children especially, they're very vulnerable, and this has been a very protracted quarantine, pandemic, you might say life-changing for our children especially. So.
Professor Van Tassel, I think we've got you for just a moment. Do you want to comment on this issue of some of the racial inequities that have really pervaded this?
In my area, I focus on vaccine clinical trials, and there was a recent study that showed that over the past 10 years, minority populations were severely underrepresented in clinical trials. And I think this was critically important because individuals need to know that if they're with their particular risk profile, that there has been good testing on both safety and efficacy. And so one of the measures that I suggest and my colleagues suggest in our paper is that we should have the Food and Drug Administration should mandate that a certain number of individuals be included in trials. And for those who worry that that would slow down a trial, my suggestion is that we set up a system that's similar to the organ donor system, where individuals can actually sign up when they're getting their driver's licenses to be members, to become a member of a clinical trial should we need them to participate during a pandemic. This could be set up by the Department of Health and Human Services. It could be privacy protected, but it would allow us to have a continuous group of individuals who'd be willing to volunteer on pretty much a drop of a hat if we needed them to participate.
Great. So this is, we've reached the end of our time, and I want to thank our extraordinary panel for both sharing their research and their thoughts on these different questions. Thank you to Dean Gilmore for joining us in the introductions, and for all of our guests who are out there and for sharing those very, very interesting questions for our discussion. I'd like to remind you that we have additional programs available tomorrow, Thursday, February 4th. We have a 4 p.m. panel on human fusions, how humanity and technology interface to change lives, and a 6:15 panel on how the global pandemic changed the future of healthcare. Details and registrations are available at case.edu/events/think showcase. Thank you also very much for joining us tonight. Enjoy the rest of your evening.